What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Jodi Liggett, an outstanding person. She is from Tempe, Arizona, and I could spend 5 minutes going over her background, including the fact that she's been involved in Planned Parenthood in Arizona. She's a fierce woman's advocate, and that's all I'm going to say. And she's going to tell us about herself and about the women's issues, about and other issues. So go ahead, Jodi, and do the best you can. I'm sure you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jodi Liggett. It's so nice to be here. I have a PowerPoint, but I'm just going to use it as a cheat sheet for me. I think it's distracting, and it's more like a conversation if we see each other's faces. So if you see me reading something, that's what I'm doing. So yeah, just a little bit about me. I'm an Arizona native, born here, grew up in Tucson and in Phoenix, spent some time in Colorado as well with my family. I've worked for Democrats and Republicans. I was Republican staff at the Arizona legislature in the House way back in the day. I also was Governor Jane Hull's policy advisor for human services, which encompassed many women's issues. Also a policy advisor to Greg Stanton, who is a Democrat in Phoenix, mayor then, now congressman. And I also helped Mayor Kate Gallego, also Phoenix mayor, get her office set up for her first year in office. I have some private sector experience, shilled for a rural metro fire department briefly after I left the administration. My husband and I also have a consulting group. We lobby on behalf of childcare providers and others. And most recently, I have started I'm still incubating a women's issues think tank. And how I'm financing that is to have a lobbying practice that represents only women's organizations. It's kind of a cool concept the way it has worked out. These are nonprofits who could not afford to hire a professional lobbyist under normal circumstances. But since they all have issues in common, we're able to do, an economy of scale thing all together. So the National Council of Jewish Women, the Arizona Association of University Women, NARAL Pro-Choice Arizona, the YWCA up here in Metro Phoenix, and the League of Women Voters. And that I've been doing that for 3 legislative sessions now. And it's just been one of the greatest experiences of my career. Really neat to work on behalf of organizations that are doing already so much in our community, and they can really have impact on all of our behalf at the legislature because they're real people doing the real stuff. So the things we look at are voting rights, education, some of the general issues, racial equity and social justice, but also childcare, violence against women, and women in the criminal justice system, and then the all-important reproductive rights, right? And I should mention, I'll go through this pretty quickly. I'm going to talk about the legislative session just to kind of level set because it's been pretty weird. I mean, extraordinarily weird. It's always weird in Arizona at our legislature. But the last 2 sessions have been really disturbing, actually, but consequential. So I'll just give you a flavor of kind of what went on this session. And then I'll talk about some women's issues, specifically reproductive rights, and then try and keep enough time so that we can have questions back and forth. So I'll get through my stuff, and then we can have all the questions that we want. Okay, so here we go. The legislative session, lots of issues running in the background, kind of. So I know we've all read in the newspaper just forever and a day about the election audit, also referred to as the fraudit. That just set people's teeth on edge generally, but it caused a lot of conflict within the legislature. This is also a redistricting year, and that always causes tension because typically one party or the other, feels like they got the short end of the stick, and then people are forced into new districts often, and then having to run against their peers in many instances. And then a lot of personal rivalries and spats. I personally witnessed Kelly Townsend and Michelle Ugenti-Rita almost come to blows on the Senate floor, which is astonishing. I mean, the lack of decorum and just the, personal, and these are people in the same party, by the way, the party that's in control right now. So I just, I've been around 25 years now doing this stuff in and around the Capitol. I've never seen anything like that. Made me sad. So a little bit, the numbers, we had another long session, one of the longest in state history, 167 days. Around 400 bills made it through, and a lot of resolutions, a lot of, the postcards to Congress that don't mean that much, but also the legislature referring issues to the ballot themselves. The whole issue of education finance and, what happens when you expand vouchers, climate and water, really critical, and they didn't get around to it until about the 11th hour. And then reproductive rights was, front and center. Major themes, I've already mentioned anger, but you've got a majority that, this extends from Donald Trump's election loss and the whole big lie that, the election was somehow manipulated. And I got to tell you, the majority and a lot of their constituents are just obsessed with this issue. There were more than 150 voting bills dropped this session. Also, more and more privatization, and we saw that of education, a failure to fully fund education, and then also a preoccupation with social issues, whether it's critical race theory or LGBTQ kids in K-12, or banning trans athletes from participating. Just really issues that are not front and center in terms of the crises that are facing our state, and disappointing that our majority just can't focus on what matters to most people. Now, that's you hear a lot of bad news and negative. I feel like I should just hand out Prozac before I give these presentations, but I'm going to run through a few areas just so everybody knows that there were so many bad things that didn't happen and bad things that got stopped. So I mentioned voting in elections, and the ton of bills that were passed, but the vast majority of them went nowhere or actually failed in committee or even failed on the floor. So, Fincham's bill to take us back to 1958, where everybody has to vote on one day in person and they all have to be counted. The obsession with drop boxes, cancellation requirements, emergency voting centers, all those, the very worst versions of those did not make it. Similarly, education, kind of dreadful things did happen in education, but requiring teachers to post all the materials and various attempts at CRT, at least in the legislative sense, did not make it through. Same thing with gun safety, one of the other things that progressives worried about. Of course, there were some bills that did make it through, but only one or two, bringing guns onto K-12 campuses, and requiring gun courses in K-12. Those things came out in the wash and didn't make it in the final analysis. So, it wasn't a complete dumpster fire at the legislature, but it's been a tough session. And just an editorial note, and we can talk about it more in our conversation back and forth. I mentioned I've been doing this kind of a long time. And one of the clients in my group, the League of Women Voters, was very determined to be physically present at the legislature to talk about these ridiculous bills that were there. And the rest of that coalition, the progressive coalition that was focused on voting rights, for their own reasons, I kind of disagreed with it, but they decided to boycott the process. So it was yours truly and a bunch of MAGA idiots in those hearings. And I'll just say, I know you all know it's bad, but I was astonished at, number one, the members of the public who were allowed to come up, and I'm just going to say lie. Right, whether it was about their volunteer work on the audit, or I saw somebody carrying 6 cases of ballots into the Maricopa County Recorder's office, like just nonsense. And then even more unfortunately, watching elected officials repeat or amplify those lies from the podium in the legislature. I'm just shocked that that happened. So kind of a similar experience in the area of reproductive rights. It wasn't, a total disaster, but a couple of really insidious things, and I'll expand on these in a minute. In the last session and this, we had a couple of pieces of legislation that create blanket liability for religious organizations, and that term is not defined. Now, ostensibly, this was a response to COVID so that people could keep going to church, even if we were under quarantine. But when you read the bill, it is so much more than that. And a lot of us in the reproductive rights space started to worry, that this would be carte blanche for doctors or, religious hospitals to just not serve women, forget abortion, but, birth control or whatever their particular religious exemption or their religious beliefs are, and be totally exempt from liability. That's crazy. What did make it through, I'm sure you've heard, the 15-week abortion ban. I would point out, people have said it, but no exceptions for rape or incest. That is really mean. And I think it's an indicator, I think it came out of an Atlantic article or Washington Post where the tagline was, "The cruelty is the point." It is the point. This is not about policy. This is not about precious babies anymore. This is about controlling women and frankly, just making their lives miserable if they do want reproductive health care. Really, really disturbing. We stopped something. 2811 was an attempt by our legislature to ban entirely, like it couldn't be brought into the state, couldn't be used, the medication that is used for medication abortions or abortion by pill. We killed that. It was hard. And it's kind of astonishing because I talked to the staff and I talked to the rules attorney and said, states can't ban something that the FDA approves. And they're just like, I know, but they're going to run it anyway. And the governor might sign it if it makes it. So kill it. So we did. And then there was also activity around contracts that are granted, that school districts grant for instance, sex education. They wanted to ban Planned Parenthood or any other reproductive rights organization from delivering those classes. I'm not aware that we do that anymore in Arizona, but of course they wanted to pass a law to make a statement. So busy, 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 and we thought it would never end. I mentioned how long the session was. And negotiating a budget was really the killer that made things take so long. And, Paul Boyer, I think people mistook him for a moderate because he's willing to buck his leadership. And he has held up the budget before in prior sessions, kind of, for what we would consider good reasons. This time, his pound of flesh is, $1 billion to the K-12 budget, but universal vouchers, which is, that is just crazy as a policy, but also the price tag on that when people start taking up their voucher opportunities, going to break the bank. I mentioned, I won't cover them here, but the legislature was very busy referring things to the ballot, mostly to make it harder for us to refer things to the ballot as citizens. They're obsessed with that, single subject requirements, legislative changes, and the other obsession they have is creating an office of lieutenant governor. I don't know why that's so important, but they want to try again. Some cool things that citizens got on the ballot. Arizonans for Fair Elections, that looks like it's going to make it. They got, I think, twice the number of signatures, so they should be fine. Stop Dark Money made it. They should be fine too. And a really cool Predatory Debt Collection Protection Act, which is focused primarily on medical debt, which is the #1 reason people go into bankruptcy, especially female-headed households. So that's great. Something that didn't make it, and I'll spend some time on it, is the Reproductive Rights Initiative. It was an attempt to amend the state constitution. and totally understandable. People are frustrated, they want to do something. But they had a very short period of time in which to operate. And this was a tough one in the reproductive rights community. There's sort of a coalition of, Planned Parenthood and NARAL and providers and advocates like me, who really for years have been doing this work at the legislature and elsewhere. And we have members who actually provide services. So a well-meaning group, but inexperienced both in the subject matter and with getting something on the ballot, took it upon themselves to draft a ballot initiative. And language is a problem in these things. And we're going to see as states continue to try and, solve this problem at their own ballot box. It's a problem. This particular initiative, I think, borrowed from Michigan's language, which is, encompasses a viability standard, which does kind of just restore Roe, or at least the underpinnings of Roe, that case, and enshrine it in the Constitution. So you certainly could do worse things, but once something's in the Constitution, it's really, really hard to change it or take it back out. And including a viability standard from a legal perspective acknowledges or concedes that the government has an interest in a woman's pregnancy. And we kind of don't want to do that if we don't have to. That was a compromise in the Roe decision that wasn't a great one. So we think this needs a lot more thought. It was unfortunate. We tried, to get the group who was doing this to pause and work with the rest of the community. They were really determined, but I'm telling you, there was literally no way this was going to, they did not have enough days. When you think about, the number of volunteers they had, and we know, the number of signatures that could get collected in a single day and the length of time, it just wasn't going to happen. And we couldn't come to terms with that. So we had a lot of everyday women, men and women, who, wanted to sign these petitions and get it on the ballot, and were unhappy and upset that the whole community wasn't as one on this. So we're going to have to watch that because we have enough enemies without, right? We don't need to be creating enemies within. So I'll keep you posted on that one. Those are my kind of formal remarks. I did want to just continue on though with reproductive rights and some backdrop on just what has happened. So we had a terrible Roe decision, right? And we've had these really, really mean-spirited laws passed all over the country over the last 15 or 20 years, targeted regulation of abortion providers, or so-called trap laws, which it's important for, people with a fair amount of privilege to understand, people who live in urban centers or who can afford to fly other places if they need an abortion. Abortion has been effectively, outlawed for most of the rural areas of our state. It's an abortion desert and has been for a number of years. So there's a lot of women out there who haven't been able to exercise that right in all this time. And that's important to remember with whatever we do on the ballot. Also, I would just say, and then we'll have a better back and forth in terms of question and answer. I think people have not been paying attention to this, and it's easy if you're a civilian to just go, there are other people taking care of this, and it's rough. I mean, when I worked at Planned Parenthood, I was threatened, not a single time, but multiple times. These crazy Arizona patriots who carry guns. My friend and I were demonstrating outside of Walgreens, and this crazy woman in cutoff shorts brandished her Luger at us. It's really frightening. These people are very intense with their beliefs. So, and they're not going to be satisfied with just outlawing abortion. The pro-life infrastructure that exists now in the United States, this is just, their first down. They want to outlaw birth control. They want to go after IVF providers, in vitro fertilization. I mean, it just goes on and on. We've seen that, back in the Reagan era when we were arguing about, and Bush, and arguing about stem cells. this issue is not just a women's issue, actually. It has tentacles everywhere. And I think everyday people don't realize that their own rights could be jeopardized, even if they're not a woman or they can't get pregnant. This is pervasive, and it sounds crazy in 2022 that people would be trying to outlaw birth control. But Roe and Casey, those cases that were struck down, provided much of the legal framework for that. So, and we've heard from the justices that they're anticipating those cases. Kind of a scary time. So we had a rough session. We have a decent coalition. We have to come back together as women, because we know that access to birth control and all forms of reproductive health care are really what put women in the driver's seat of their own lives. It enables girls to graduate from high school and college on time. It just allows, we know for a long time, conservatives and Republicans were obsessed with marriage and pushing marriage. And the Brookings Institution came out with a really interesting study that both validated and refuted that. And I think it's interesting for women. The issue is not people being married as much as it is people not having children until they're ready, until they are educated and financially secure. That's really the driver. It's not whether people are married or not, it's whether they were ready to be parents. So I think we ought to just keep that in mind, because that drives everything else: our welfare caseloads, our child welfare caseloads, educational failure. It's just so many things, branches on the tree that have a common root. So I'll leave it at that now, and let's take some questions and have a conversation.
First of all, why do you suppose, Jodi, that this is such a wedge issue in this country?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some weird history with that. I think, we talked about abortion being, almost the original wedge issue. Actually, prohibition and drinking, that was an early wedge issue, an early experience that the country had. Now, of course, with disastrous results, right? Prohibition didn't work. But in our political history, conservatives learned that there were single issue voters. Then, just historically speaking, you all are at least as old as I am. You'll remember in the Reagan era, he nominated Robert Bork. And that was the first time that the nomination process really got politicized, and Democrats nailed him, and largely on this issue. And that ignited the right, particularly the religious right. And the more, immediately in the post-Roe era, this is when you had clinic bombings and just really horrible stuff. And they all of a sudden realized there were millions and millions of people out there who were single issue voters, who would vote for a candidate expressly and only based on their position on abortion. What their tax position, their position on education, or whatever, didn't matter. It was whether they were pro-life or pro-choice. So, and then it works, right? It helps people win elections. It helps them get reelected. It activates their base. It's just like crack. They can't get off it because it's so simple and it works. And I think, unfortunately, that has kind of moved on. There was so much, I'm just going to say, lying and misrepresentation about, what abortion is and who performs it and who gets it. And I think those were the very beginnings of the big lie, when conservatives have just realized over decades that they can just lie and there are no consequences. Very disturbing, but I think we have more experience with this than we realize. And I think, we have some good tools to combat it, but it's going to be a rough fight.
Okay, Jodi, I find it a little more than a little ironic that pro-life people don't mind bombing clinics where people could die. It's maybe they feel that they're justified. Another one I'd like to have you address would be the rape and incest exception. I mean, do these people really believe that a 12-year-old girl should be expected to carry and give birth to a child. I think that happened recently.
It happened in Indiana. And the answer to your question, and this isn't what I think, it's what actually happened in Indiana. If y'all watched that unfold in the news, it was absolutely dreadful. I think the girl in that case was actually 11. I mean, I look at pictures of my daughter when she was 11 and I just think, oh my gosh. And you had the Attorney General in Indiana talking about not having a rape kit or, not having a police report, which as a lawyer, I'm thinking, when you have an 11-year-old who's pregnant, you don't need any of that stuff. It's statutory rape, period. You may not know who did it, but certainly there's no question that this girl has been violated. She cannot consent to sexual activity, specifically, any activity that would lead to a pregnancy. So that is how callous these people are, and in what a hurry they were to discredit her doctor, and discredit her legal team. So they didn't believe the girl, they didn't believe her parents, they didn't believe her female lawyer. They did believe the rapist finally when he came forward. That's just astonishing to me. So yeah, there apparently, the benefits of focusing incessantly on this issue outweigh the downside. I think all of us are going to have to get a lot more vocal when public officials do this, because it's just crazy. And when they say there are no exceptions, there are no exceptions. So what will happen, there is an exemption in our old territorial law that may come into play, and our own 15-week ban that just passed this session. They make an exception for the life of the mother. But that means, the doctor can't just say, I think at some point her life will be in danger. Her life has to be in danger. So the doctors have to sit there and wait till somebody goes septic. Or for instance, wait until this poor little girl ruptures her abdominal membranes. Or, I mean, it's just crazy. The medical profession has got to step forward. The Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have been terrific. But the American Medical Association has only just recently, stepped into this area. And it's really not about abortion anymore. It is about the doctor-patient relationship and who gets to say. So I'll be quiet because I think there are more questions that'll, drive this conversation.
Yes.
Well, I was very curious about two questions. What Arizona law is currently in effect, because there is some confusion about which one is which. The older one or the newer one. The other thing is, I hear pushback constantly from Republicans saying there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can have reproductive rights. So what did the Supreme Court base their Roe versus Wade decision on? So I'll let you answer those two thoughts.
With regard to our laws in Arizona and what will take effect. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth in the news, and Doug Ducey saying something that wasn't actually the case. So we have this 120-year-old pre-statehood ban. That's an absolute ban. There are actually three sections of the statute: one that addresses providers, one that addresses women themselves, and then one that addresses advertisers or people who assist the woman obtaining her services. Last session, probably in anticipation of all this, the Center for Arizona Policy got the section that would criminalize women repealed. And I think they did that because they know that's when they'll lose the public if they start throwing mothers in jail. That's going to be a non-starter, but they're more than happy to throw doctors in jail and anybody who tries to help. So that territorial ban is really strict. The 15-week ban would allow abortions up to 15 weeks of pregnancy, but similarly, does not have any humanitarian exceptions other than the life of the mother. Now, this gets a little complicated. The territorial law was has been under a long-term injunction since I think since 1973, there was litigation in Southern Arizona, in Tucson specifically, by Planned Parenthood and their clinic there at the time, seeking to strike that down. They lost, right? So the court here found that in the Arizona Constitution, there was not, a right to privacy or a right to reproductive health care, and that this statute could stand, even though it was old. 2 days later, I think 2 or 3 days, it was not a long time, the Roe decision came down from the Supreme Court. And so the court had to reverse its decision and rule in accordance with the Roe precedent. But that means that the pre-statehood law is, as regards Southern Arizona, but it really applies to the whole state, is still under an injunction, and the Attorney General needs to seek to overturn that. Now, Brnovich has made noises like his office is doing that. He may have filed the paperwork when I'm not looking, but as of a few weeks ago, he still hadn't done that. So there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action, and it creates this terrible uncertainty for providers and women, right? So they're afraid to provide services. I believe that absolutely that older ban applies, and they will get around to, especially before he leaves office, getting that injunction lifted. So we'll have a ban here, and it's one of the strictest in the country. We don't have a Texas style kind of bounty on people's heads, like a monetary incentive. I think it's $10,000 in Texas. So we shouldn't have too much of like neighbors informing on other people. But I think a lot of us are worried about, we have all this technology now that allows companies and the government to track consumer behaviors down to the individual level. And that's really scary, because I think, it just depends on who's in office. If you get someone like the Indiana AG, and we have plenty of those types here in Arizona who want to make example of an 11-year-old girl, they'll do it. So we really are going to have to go back to the ballot and protect ourselves. This notion on, the Supreme Court and their rationale, the Roe decision has been controversial, not in effect, but just legally. There isn't a line in the United States Constitution that says you have a right to reproductive health, or even that you have a right to privacy necessarily. It was an interpretation, and that was in a period of time when the Supreme Court was, treating the Constitution, at least the majority on the court was treating the Constitution like a living document that, gets adapted by the court to changing times and changing attitudes, not wholesale, but that we can interpret it so that it's meaningful for the modern era. Now you have all these Federalist Society folks who've been appointed to the court, and they are a majority, and they don't believe any of that. They don't believe there's any room for interpretation, at least on reproductive health. It's black letter law. If it's in the Constitution, it's authorized. If it's not, you're done. Now they don't apply that uniformly, but we're stuck with that for a while. John Roberts, as conservative as he is, was much more in touch, most of the time with what was going to cause, just dreadful social unrest, and kind of step back from the brink on a couple of occasions. Specifically, universal health care, right? Obamacare, he played that role, but no more. He's outnumbered, so they don't need him for the majority anymore. So really, really cannot look to the court. This is a new era. We don't have the Supreme Court as a backstop anymore, and the individual states are going to have to look at their constitutions and what they can do to protect people's rights within the states.
Okay, Jodi, we have two chat questions for you. Maybe you could see them. One says, will the reproductive rights petition be targeted for the 2024 election ballot, is one question. The next question was, where do women in Arizona go? Which state could they go to for an abortion? Does that have anything to do with what Joe Biden signed in the last few days? This, where they can cross state lines, et cetera?
Yes, so a bunch of us we've reached out to the coalition that did this year's ballot initiative, and we all want to like be friends and right, we're in this together, we have to do it. And yes, 2024, absolutely, we have to strike while the iron's hot, because we don't know. The public is kind of funny on this issue. Like in general, they've been in the same place generally for 30 years, but within that, there are shifts, and there's differences in how far everyday people are willing to go to protect rights. Now it's been so all over the news and kind of catastrophic. I think there've been a number of really sad cases. So I think public opinion will hang with us till 2024, but we do have a sense of urgency about that. And then I apologize, the second question was, oh, where can women go? Where women can go, just outside, not just outside, I think like 45 minutes outside of Yuma is El Centro, California. There's a huge Planned Parenthood clinic there, and they are all over it. They are staffed up to serve folks from Arizona who are coming there for care. Also, Nevada, specifically Las Vegas, I know, and abortion is legal in New Mexico. I haven't heard as many formalized arrangements. And then people should know that there are a couple of abortion funds in Arizona that don't just raise money, to help people travel, but actually, facilitate that travel and identify places where folks could go. So if you just Googled abortion funds, there's a national network, and you can find folks in Arizona who are absolutely willing to help. And I say you should donate to those as much as you can. The executive order that Biden signed will protect people who do that, and specifically protect folks who cross state lines to either help someone get an abortion or to get those services themselves. Because I've mentioned it a couple times. I mean, the last 2 years have just been shocking to me, how far Republicans are willing to go to prosecute individual women. So I think the norms that we all have considered to be in place for so long. I worked for Jane D. Hull. She was a Republican. But that was when you were allowed to be a pro-choice Republican. She was Catholic, she had her own views, but she didn't want to legislate for everyone else. And I remember her saying, and I use this term all the time, she said, Jodi, laws are blunt, clumsy instruments, and there's some topics that they are just not suited to. And this is one of them. There's so many permutations. There's so many things that can go wrong in a pregnancy. It's actually a really dangerous time for a woman. It's far more dangerous than getting an abortion, especially in the first 3 months. So that kind of Republican is gone forever. They are not allowed to be, in the party. They'll primary you, they'll drum you out of office. So what we've got left are at the very least pro-life, and more often just viciously anti-woman, I would say. So I'm sorry to say that, but it's true.
George has a question again. George?
What's up, George?
Question for you. I'm starting to watch all the ad campaigns coming out, and we're watching Hobbs and Kelly and Mays and Ingalls and Fontes, and they're talking about, one of the main topics they're talking about are abortion rights. Will those candidates carry the state of Arizona, much like what happened in Kansas, even though that particular item is not on the ballot?
I'll tell you, we do at Planned Parenthood, we did polling all the time. And of course, in our coalition, we continue to just look at public attitudes, generally, and then, specifically in the electorate, in, attitudes among people who actually vote. And this, especially, it was always true that the majority of Americans want abortion to be legal, in some form. And then they vary on each end of some people are fine with it till birth. Some people really have an issue with late term abortions, but in general, they want it to be legal. They want women to be able to access that service. So it has been a good issue to run on before. And now with the Roe decision, which I think the general public just was not prepared for, frankly. Yeah, I think people have had a slap in the face, a dash of cold water, whatever, wake up call, whatever you want to say. And they really all of a sudden realize, oh, half the population just lost a constitutional right, and they're going to keep going unless we stop them. So I do think that candidates can run and win. Now they have to have, their own funding and a good plan and a path to victory. But yes, I think people will vote on that basis. And, there are still those suburban Republican women who can swing elections. And that's how you get to those women, because they don't talk about it a lot, but they're pro-choice. They're pro-choice. They just don't talk about it.
Okay, the percentage of people that are pro-choice is more than half. I know, right?
Oh, yeah.
About 70%. But so this doesn't represent what the people want. It's political, correct?
Absolutely. Right. I mean, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, they figured out it was a wedge issue, which doesn't mean, by the way, that there aren't people, everyday people in that movement who are very sincere. I would see them outside of the Planned Parenthood clinic, just quietly, respectfully saying their rosary and doing a prayer. Like, those people have very sincere beliefs. But the movement, the financed piece of this, the political piece of it, is not concerned about women at all. And I don't even think legitimately, that pro-life specifically, because we know what the very same folks do once that baby comes out of the birth canal. They're on their own. Right? I mean, we have an abysmal child welfare system in Arizona. Don't get me started on our K-12 system. And, we haven't even extended postpartum care up to a full year, which is what you really need for poor women. So none of those things are pro-life. It really is this political issue that they've figured out can move elections and specifically elected officials. But you're right. I think depending on what poll you look at, yeah, it's about 70%. If you ask the question in a certain way and people realize like it's an all or nothing thing, then you get like into the 90s, like 92% of people who are like, well, I don't want it to be banned. I just don't want it to be easy. They're like, I don't want people to use it as birth control, which, newsflash, nobody uses abortion like that. But yeah, the public is compassionate in general. They don't want to persecute women.
Well, I could pretend to be crazy and say to you, Democrats want to kill babies. They want to have abortions on the last day of 8 months, 30 days. They want to allow abortions, and then they want to, if the baby is born, then they decide, the woman and the doctor decide whether or not they're going to kill it. Now, you've heard that, right? You've heard those kinds of wild, crazy, exaggerated things. How do you deal with that? I think I know the answer, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can battle that kind of stuff with facts, which is, out of all the abortions that occur in a given year, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction that are late term. And then first of all, this is tough for an advocate like me to talk about, because we really don't want to get into this like there are good abortions and there are bad abortions, right? Like, that's why this has to be between women and their physicians. But just as a matter of fact, when you look at late term abortions, the majority of those are, first of all, wanted pregnancies and of women who are already mothers, and something has gone horribly wrong and they need that care. And I mentioned, you've got physicians practicing defensive medicine, and who can blame them given the legal situation. but who will wait for you to get septic. We have a woman in our coalition who had to travel with her husband to California to have a selective reduction because she had a twin pregnancy and one twin was going septic and was going to kill the other twin and the mom, who also had 3 other children. So you're pro-life and you want to save this one precious baby who, by the way, is not going to survive anyway, and you're going to kill the other one, kill mom, and leave these 3 kids as an orphan. That's not pro-life. That's a bunch of BS. So this whole notion that, we're Planned Parenthood is selling baby parts and, everybody should have an abortion just for the experience, right? Like, that's just mythology. And I think how we combat that is with facts and with, people's stories. And I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, these are incredibly private decisions that people make. And I have just watched woman after woman, come forward and tell their story because they're so worried that another woman, will not be able to avail themselves of the right. But good Lord, right? They just have to rip open, the most personal thing they've ever done and put it on public display, so they can try and stop this nonsense. That's asking a lot. So I would just encourage anyone out there who does have a story to be brave so that it's, not on the shoulders of a handful of people. So that's my soapbox on that topic.
No, that's really good. You have some passionate answers to questions. Another chat. Please repeat the states where women can go and the name of the fund to help them. And you said El Centro, California.
El Centro, California. Abortion is legal in New Mexico. I'm not aware of like a border city clinic, but I'm sure there are referrals there. And then Las Vegas, Nevada, abortion is legal in Nevada, and there's no waiting period. There's no waiting period in California either, so people can, fly or drive out there and get back the same day, which is so critical because these are, a lot of moms, women who are already moms, or, younger women in dire circumstances, and they need to be able to do that. Off the top of my head, I can send it to you all. I can't remember, but if you Google Abortion Fund of Arizona, that'll get you into, there's a whole abortion fund network, and you'll be able to find a place to donate and refer people.
Excuse me. Jodi, I did have a question for you. This random thought. At one point during history, women died in fairly large numbers giving birth. And let's say 100 years ago, what are the percentages then as opposed to now? Also, I know in certain populations, there are more deaths in childbirth than in other populations in the country or in the world.
Right. Yeah, I wish I had the numbers right off the top of my head, but I can give you a sense. Like so many other things, right? 100 years ago, as birth was a pregnancy and birth, could be a really dangerous time. If you had a complication, there wasn't anybody to call, or at least not in close range. So maternal mortality was fairly high, and infant mortality, right? You hear about, big families, but, a third of the kids died in infancy. So before we got, modern sanitation and science-based medical practices, I'll just say, that was a huge problem. It's not, the percentages are lower now, but not as low as they should be for the United States. We have the worst maternal and infant mortality in the industrialized world. I wish I had the numbers at my disposal. I can send them to you, but there's a huge gap, and it's completely unnecessary. And then you mentioned racial disparities. Yeah, and it's a symptom of just health disparities in general. But Indigenous women in Arizona, it's an access to care issue. But there are just really dreadful maternal mortality statistics. And I mentioned extending Medicaid coverage for a full year postpartum. This would dramatically impact that. Black and Latino women also have very poor birth outcomes relative, here to the rest of the country. And then also, I think Arizona is in the top 10 worst maternal mortality for the states. And then globally, the United States is at the bottom of the developed nations. So it doesn't need to be that way. And, birth control, so you don't have unplanned pregnancies in the first place, and access to prenatal care are the two big things. And our state invests no state dollars in family planning at all. So there's some federal funds that come through, but I think if you were seriously pro-life and you were worried about precious babies, you would want everyone who wanted it to have birth control, right? I'll digress for just a second. Colorado did this amazing experiment, making the most effective forms of birth control available to anybody, any woman who wanted them or needed them at no cost. Because some, like IUDs, are really expensive and implants can be really expensive. 50% drop in unplanned pregnancies, 50% drop in teenage pregnancies, like astonishing numbers that if it were in the subject matter area, like this practice would have been adopted. Can you imagine if it was heart disease or something? Like that would have been immediately adopted as a best practice across the United States. But our country's so messed up about sex and anything that has to do with sex. They're not making those investments. Obamacare was a major step forward, but still effective birth control is too far out of reach for most women.
All right. I think, we don't have too many other questions. I should be, but let's see, is there anything else? No. Those who say that life begins at conception, I assume that the morning after pill is immoral and whatever else. How do you combat that? I guess you don't combat it. You just don't.
Well, we can combat that with some facts, because our opposition has been pushing that narrative for a really long time. Folks should know that there was a personhood provision put into statute, and personhood is the legal concept that sperm hits egg, that's a person. That's a human being with as many rights as you or me. So anything that happens from that point on is potentially murder. So maybe mom doesn't, practice the best prenatal care, or maybe she has a drug problem. She could be thrown in jail. Nobody's getting an abortion, certainly at any stage, if you've got personhood. That provision has been enjoined. You can thank the National Council of Jewish Women and the ACLU and others who litigated that. So that's on hold for at least a year while we sort it all out. But you mentioned the morning after pill. Our opposition is trying so hard to conflate, Plan B, which is the morning after pill, with medication abortion. That's one thing that they do. And reporters get this wrong all the time. So our opposition is doing a good job confusing people. And then also with regard to certain methods, even IUDs, but especially they like to pick on the birth control pill and pick on the morning after pill as abortifacients. This is not the case. Some other time, I'll tell you a whole story about, Plan B getting FDA approval, and there was a big compromise in them having to include language that made it sound like part of the way that this drug was effective was, just preventing a fertilized egg from being implanted. So that would be, an abortifacient. These medications prevent a pregnancy from occurring in the first place. That's how they work. The birth control pill works that way. They prevent conception from taking place in the first place. But that narrative is persistent and stubborn. And they're not going to stop. In Colorado, I think they have had personhood on the ballot in a bad way. I think 8 or 9 times they've voted that down. So these people don't quit. They're on a mission. They have a bigger objective.
I assume this is a off the wall. Cloning, I guess, would be sinful to the moral majority.
You're absolutely right. And I keep thinking there may be, I mean, it's at a terrible cost, but there actually might be a silver lining here. I do think the next step for these folks is to go after IVF in vitro, because, we know how that works. People store their eggs and sperm, or store fertilized eggs. It's very common for, after implantation to have to do a selective reduction if there are too many fertilized eggs that take hold. Not everybody wants to be an octomom, and it's actually really dangerous to have, more than a twin or triplet pregnancy. Though that's all murder to these people. It's frankly murder if, someone gets divorced and they say, you know what, we want those fertilized eggs destroyed because, our marriage didn't work out and we just want to move on. They're going to come after that. And I think that is going to be a bridge too far for even, some people who consider themselves pro-life, because, right, it's like, what is the outer limit here? So I think they are going to go too far, but unfortunately, they'll have to actually go too far. I think there will actually have to be legislation, and real people will have to suffer consequences before, kind of the general public realizes, oh, we should have really worked harder to stop this.
Right. What are the outer limits? Stem cell,
Right.
that's another one too. And how do you combat it? Well, you can't, I guess. You can't persuasively convince everyone. It's just going to be, George has a question or comment.
Yeah, thank you for touching on childcare, because it was on my list too. So thank you for doing that, how bad Arizona is. But what is out there as far as sex education in our schools? I mean, if you start talking about it earlier, at least kids begin to know what it's about. So would you comment on that?
Yeah, glad you asked. Exactly. Yeah, I wish I had better news for us, but so the state of sex education in Arizona is dreadful. This is something we really advocated for at Planned Parenthood, and just a couple of myths to bust. And they were like things that, probably I believed on some level when I was new to this issue. But specifically, when we started to advocate for sex education in schools, and, not necessarily as Planned Parenthood, like we wanted to deliver those services, but we were combating things like abstinence-only education, which Republicans are in love with, which the data show is actually worse than doing nothing. So you have teens who, make an abstinence promise or whatever, and they will delay sexual activity, but when they finally, break that pledge, they're underground about it. They don't tell anybody, and therefore they don't use birth control, and therefore, predictably, a lot of them wind up with an unplanned pregnancy. So the outcomes for abstinence only are just dreadful, or even abstinence based. It's just too much. And if you've ever seen the curriculum and some of the audiovisual aids that are used in those kinds of courses, the way that they shame girls and make them responsible for the sexual conduct of boys is appalling. And on that basis alone, we should not want to do it. Plus the fact that it just doesn't work. We do know that medically accurate and comprehensive sex education helps kids both delay first sexual activity, until they are ready, not because they promise their dad and they wear a ring or something. It's a decision that they've made for themselves about when they want to become sexually active. So they'll delay typically, and then they absolutely use birth control and protect themselves against sexually transmitted infections, because they got to learn that stuff in a non-shaming environment. And, people say this should happen at home. Sure, it should. Guess what? There are a million crappy parents out there. So we have to backfill that in public schools. We do it all the time. We do it with nutrition. We do it with dental care. We do it with all sorts of things. Sexual health is just part of the continuum of healthcare, but people are really messed up about it. And I'll just mention another thing with, first of all, it has become so controversial that school boards and superintendents are terrified to do anything. So what you'll find in most cases, and of course, there's no central repository of any of this information because it's all local control and there's no reporting requirements. But most districts and individual schools just don't teach sex education, or they do some, really benign kind of health ed or family living, but it's not, what we would consider. And then the ones that do, there's still a fair amount of abstinence only out there, because until recently you could get money for that, federal money, and very little medically accurate, comprehensive. And when I say comprehensive, that also encompasses LGBTQ and trans kids and their issues. And we know that that is so important because, when you don't acknowledge someone's even existence in that instruction, they're not going to know how to take care of themselves. A big part of this comprehensive education is teaching kids how to navigate these interpersonal situations when they're being pressured to either have sex or have unprotected sex. So it's really, for people who actually roll up their sleeves and work with kids and communities, they know how important this is. When Planned Parenthood was advocating and organizing for this, where we had the most success? In Latino communities, which is counterintuitive. People tend to think that all Hispanics are Catholic and they, don't want to do any of this. That may have been true at one time. I'm not sure. 98% of Catholics use birth control. So I think that whole Catholic thing is a little bit overblown. But specifically in our Hispanic and Latino populations, these are folks who are like, they're bought into the American dream. They have been as successful as they can, and they sure want their girls to graduate from high school and get that high school education, and their boys to be responsible and respectful. So I could not believe the number of Latino dads that we had going to school board meetings advocating for this. And I think that really says it all.
And also, I just want to tell you, I was in a meeting many years ago, and a father stood up, and they're talking about sex education. He says, "I don't want my daughter learning about administration."
Slur on words.
So you just, so that's why
He's gonna learn about it when it happens.
I know, but
That's right.
sometimes that's the kind of thing you're up against. So George, I think we might
I
be.
just wanted to wrap up and say, yeah, I grew up in Colorado, and they were teaching sex education in Jefferson County 60 years ago. And my mom with 7 kids said, I want my kids to learn how. So learn the proper, I should back that bus up, to learn the proper understanding of what sex is about. Jodi, want to thank you, and I appreciate your touching on childcare, because for me that was a big issue too. So thank you for being here. We appreciate the great information. If you want to send anything to anybody that was here, send it to me, and I will make sure that we drip it out. Jodi did, for everybody that's here, Jodi did talk on the referendums that are out there. There are 3 that are posted at headquarters, and these are the CISS. These are the Citizens Initiative, and these were the petitions that we had: dark money, healthcare rising, and Arizona for fair elections. So those will be on the ballot. There are 8 others, and we, as the club, have made a stand on them. We will be posting what that stand is. There are the state statutes. There's 3 of those, and 5 of them are constitutional changes. Thank you all for being here. Paul, anything else we need to add?
Just that, Jodi, we can't thank you enough. You're an outstanding person for us to have today, and really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. And feel free to invite me back in the fall, and we can talk about childcare and early childhood education. That would be a cool topic.
We would love to have you. We'd love to have you. All right,
You bet.
that's it.
Thank
Take care,
you all.
everybody.